Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out the Emperor's greatest weapon, literally the bolt gun. This is a Lutin video, so I'm excited. Let's get into it. There is indeed only war. I appreciate that Lutin reminds us of this every video. Okay, interesting music choices. Bullet is more than a mere munition. Ancient thing. It's an echo of every bullet ever fired. Okay, I kind of like that. Every death dealt out by the hand of man since the beginning. Well, that's not true. Bolt thunder in the sound of humanity's bloody history made real. Interesting. I think there's a long history of people killing each other without bolt weapons, but okay.
In this episode of Lore Gear, we will take a look at one of the core weapons of choice for the Imperium of Man's superhuman soldiers, the Astartes, or Space Marines. It's also used by the female warriors of the Imperial Ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Sororitas, the bolt weapons. Now these are the relatively standard issue tools of the Imperium's finest.
I love how in the picture he's using, you can see it says for Dorn and for Glory. Interesting. That's very Imperial fisty.
Although many Marines can carry specific patterns or adaptations. For both the Astartes and the Sororitas, they are more than just a weapon, but actually a holy symbol of the Emperor of Man's wrath to be wrought upon the enemies of the Imperium. Bolters to many Astartes are divine weapons.
Everything, every tool, everything an Astarte uses has a divine connotation. It's one of those things. I think it seems weird to us, but I think that's true of a lot of traditional or deeply religious societies, where like almost anything even remotely connected to it, connected to the sacred act itself, in this case war fighting, takes on a holy or reverent significance.
Signify mankind's total supremacy over the filthy Xenos that they must continually crush and eradicate. Because of their status...
At least he knows that's how the fiction tends to go, right? Xenos exist only as... they exist only to test the main character's plot armor as they throw themselves hopelessly against, the protagonist and his allies, only to be destroyed at the last minute. There's also always a super weapon.
As weapons in the Imperium, any ordinary human who were to be found in possession of even a single Astartes bolt round, let alone a weapon itself, would expect to suffer severe punishment. Bolt weapon.
Okay, this is interesting because the modern military is also extremely controlling about its hardware. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Paul, you're in the United States. You guys sell assault rifles in every Walmart, every gun store, every corner store. No, we do not, because an assault rifle, technically, is selective fire, which means it's got to have safe, semi, and something else. So what you have, what are sold in the civilian market, are actually what are sometimes called assault-style rifles, right? They're intentional facsimiles of military-style rifles. But for actual military hardware, ranging from standard-issue pistols, which are in no way, shape, or form different from the civilian market, all the way up to things like fighter aircraft and Hellfire missiles, the prohibition on giving them to civilians is tremendous, absolutely tremendous. There's actually legislation that governs the sale of military hardware. Now, obviously, there are some classes of item that you can buy in your military surplus store. You know, I have a million videos of it on my second channel. You can buy a military grade sleeping bag. You can buy a military grade rucksack. And those are actually great. If you're an outdoorsman, they are awesome. They are so much more rugged than the stuff they're producing now, and they're so much more reliably constructed because the military obviously QA/QCs their contracts really well. But when it comes to warfighting devices or sensitive like avionics, for example, or other things that reflect a lot of time and effort and things that the U.S. believes gives it a competitive edge over its adversaries, the level of security around them is unreal. When I was on active duty, they would every month require you to do a by serial number inventory of every single one of these sensitive items. They also include communications equipment. You know, even when I was deployed, it was even more strict. Sometimes it was down to like the day that you had to report in your sensitive items. But even companies, private companies that manufacture these weapons or even their precursor parts are subject to strict security and quality control standards to prevent them from being sold to an adversary. Even, for example, let's say an adversary who had a front company in the United States. So, again, this is actually, it sounds like some crazy over-the-top Warhammer 40k universe, like extreme, but nope, this is pretty normal.
Weapons come in a large quantity of variations and patterns and can also be scaled down to a pistol or scaled up as a heavy weapon. It may also be combined with other weapons to create dual platforms of, say, bolter and flamer or bolter and melter. And there are also other iterations such as the Storm Bolter, often used by Space Marines wearing sacred Terminator armor. There are other variants which are even found on Titans or super heavy tanks like the devastating Vulcan Mega Bolter. Standard bolt guns fire a self-propelling explosive bolt which will ignite as it leaves the weapon and is then designed to penetrate and detonate, essentially blowing its target apart from the inside out.
Okay, this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First, the idea that a weapon design is perfected and then everything is sort of a variant of it is actually taken right out of the USSR's playbook. In obviously the post-World War II 1940s, our friend, I think it's Andrei Kalashnikov, developed the Kalashnikov Rifle. And it was a huge innovation. It was cheap, easy to produce, extremely reliable, extremely simple to maintain, extremely easy to operate, and could be relatively accurate up to 300 meters, which is, of course, they found in the Second World War, where 85% of engagements took place. So, this design proved so effective that the Soviets, when they wanted a sniper rifle, they just took the AK design, tightened up the tolerances, lengthened out the barrel, but kept the same fundamental mechanism to produce the Dragunov. When they needed a belt-fed heavy machine gun, they took the exact same design again and produced the RPK, which can be belt-fed or magazine-fed, I think. Commenters, let me know if I got that right. But the idea that the Soviets had this system that worked great and super reliably, and by expanding it or creating all these variations, right? One, you wouldn't have to retool your factories so much. Two, you wouldn't have to retrain your people quite as much. And three, you wouldn't have to retrain your maintainers and your armorers quite so much, right? So if you could fix a Kalashnikov, an AK-47, you could probably figure out how to make the Dragunov work, and you could probably do your maintenance on the RPK. So this sort of core design staying the same and then scaling it up to a bunch of variants, absolutely drawn straight from the real world.
It's a common misunderstanding to confuse these weapons with the more crude early history projectile weapons, as they look and operated similarly, but the size of the rounds and the devastating power of them far exceeds comparatively crude weapons of prehistory. A standard bolt gun magazine can contain 20 or 30 rounds, and the weapons operate with a semi-automatic or 3-round burst operation. Bolt guns will make a literal roar when fired, and their sound is deafening. This is caused by the propellant in the bolt shells igniting as they leave the weapon. This is then followed through by the detonation on reaching target. These bolts are also used in fully automatic weapons such as assault cannons, which you usually see wielded only by Terminators or Dreadnoughts.
Other interesting fact about the bolter process. It sounds like it is taken from things like heat rounds or even RPG rounds, where you achieve penetration through armor, and then only when you've cleared the armor does the round explode. It's also interesting that the rocket propellant, again, is something taken from an RPG round, which of course is rocket propelled. But there was also experiments in, I think, the 50s to produce these self-propelling bullets that had tiny little, rocket rounds coming out of them. And I don't believe mechanically there was any fundamental issue with bullets behaving this way, right? You still have the chemical process of the propellant burning to drive the round forward. It's just the propellant stays with the projectile. But ultimately, I'm not actually sure why they didn't adopt it. Probably just because it wasn't any better than a bullet, and the entire militaries and hunting communities throughout the country and the world really were tooled for self-contained cartridges that burned their propellant within the weapon and then just sent the bullet forward with kinetic energy. But again, the fundamental concept is something we already use as in our tank heat rounds or RPGs or anti-tank shoulder-mounted weapons. So definitely nothing new under the sun, as they say.
A standard bolt has a diamantine tip with a depleted deuterium core. Diamantine is a composite ceramic material used by the Imperium to fabricate weapons, ammunition, even armor. And diamantine is taken to meaning resembling a diamond's molecular structure and is more probably an industrialized product used in this composite. Now, bolt weapons are constructed by the Adeptus Mechanicus.
Okay, I'm not like a material science person, but you can't be a diamond and ceramic. But what is interesting is that a lot of tools, right, high-end mechanics tools, do have very fine diamonds sort of spread throughout in the casting to give them an extra level of hardness and resilience.
Mechanicus or Space Marine forges. They're designed to be utilized not by ordinary humans but by the adapted superhuman forces of the Imperium. The weight of a standard bolt weapon would require supportive bracing for any ordinary human and be generally impractical. Not to mention...
Okay, again, we say, oh, it's impractical, but that's not true. Even modern forces, we just call them crew-served weapons. These are weapons that are too heavy and cumbersome to fire in a small arms configuration. Small arms just means that an individual person can carry and operate the weapon. Crew-served weapons are ones that require a couple of people. So it's not uncommon to have a weapon system, again, say the Mark 19, where if it's not mounted on a vehicle platform, it is actually deployed as you'd be hard-pressed to carry it. Maybe a better example would be like the 240 Bravo, right? 240 Bravo is a heavy machine gun, and you can absolutely deploy it in the field and carry it. You just need a 3-person crew to do so. Someone needs to carry the tripods usually and the spare barrels and ammunition. And of course, there's the gunner himself who has some ammunition, and you might even have a third person with even more ammunition. So you can get a fairly heavy weapon system if you're just willing to part it out a little bit and have a crew trained to fight and deploy the weapon together. Again, it wouldn't look like a Space Marine is going to run with it. It would be more like something you would set up in, say, an entrenched fighting position or to secure a base, unless, of course, you're willing to mount it to a wheeled vehicle, which, again, could be something that the Imperium could easily do.
Mention the severe recoil, which would be far too heavy for most humans and likely cause severe damage, even possibly breaking or dislocating limbs.
Right, I know it sounds like the super badass thing, and it is, but we have those weapons. We mount them to tanks. Or a 50 cal, right? I mean, if I don't know, would you break your arm if you shot a 50 cal like on full auto? Probably not. but you probably couldn't do it very long, and you would probably have like some really severe bruising. At some point, I should have taken a picture of it. I actually went to the range and was shooting my Mosin going into this hunting season. And the Mosin is famously a pretty unforgiving rifle. Shoots a big round, a full-size round, if there ever was one. About on par with a 30-06. But it has only a steel plate as its butt plate. It doesn't absorb any of the kinetic energy of the gun. The steel plate is literally just to keep the stock from cracking. And after about 30 rounds, I ended up with this black bruising all down my shoulder. I mean, it was like extremely unsightly. My wife was like mortified, and it really did look like I had done something horrible to it. All this to say that, again, the idea of a weapon that hurts you back, again, nothing new under the sun.
Bolt weapons are of course used by Imperial Guard when mounted on vehicles or static support platforms. Pistol variants though are utilised by some Imperial Guard, usually only officers. Now there are at least 21 patterns utilised by the Astartes, 3 by the Sororitas, and then various others by Mechanicus and other human factions. And as with most things in the 41st millennium, adaptation and lost schematics make the numbers always unreliable and open to change. Some bolt guns are famous enough to be named, like Rogel Dawn's tactical bolter, the Voice of Terror. Dawn the...
Sorry, terror? Terror like the fear, or terror like the place?
Imperial Fist's Primarch had this presented to him by the Adeptus Custodes, honouring him on his appointment as Praetorian of Terror. Others, such as the Executioner's Voice, are ancient relics, and this Artificer bolt gun was created before the Horus Heresy, wielded by a Dark Angel's Librarian. But this weapon, along with the Librarian, was lost in the warp, became fused into a Space Hulk known as Oletheros. It would later be discovered by a team of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but then lost again as their ship would become also fused into this Space Hulk. It would finally be retrieved by the Dark Angels Astartes when they would then discover this ancient relic weapon, along also with its STC pattern. More recent
Oh, interesting. See, I was going to ask if it was only legendary because it was so old, or because it was just a typical artificer bolter of the era and one of the few surviving copies. But it's interesting that they also found the STC for the bolter, which makes me think that it was somehow intrinsically legendary, right? It wasn't just a standard artificer bolter that just happened to last a while, which is also sort of interesting, right? I want to say there's a museum in Turkey, I think, that preserves some awesome examples of medieval and pre-modern weaponry. But it's interesting that often the only ones that survive, for fairly obvious reasons, are ones that were more ceremonial. So it would be like a scimitar presented to a sultan, so it would have very intricate engraving and be very elaborate, but it's much harder to have the scimitars that were seen as commonplace and unexceptional and not very special. And so the result, of course, is that when you go to a museum, you may not be seeing authentic battle-worn stuff unless they tell you otherwise. But it's just interesting the way that, like, if people know that something is valuable, they safeguard it, but by the act of not safeguarding the invaluable things, they make them valuable. This is also how, like, the children's toy market works. You know, like in the 70s, nobody gave a crap if you bought your kid some Luke Skywalker figurine. You weren't going to keep it in the box. That's preposterous, right? So but the result is that here we are, 50 years later, and almost nobody has those, original figurines in the box, making them extremely, extremely valuable. In contrast, these stupid Yadro figurines. If you ever seen them, they're porcelain figurines that they sold for like $60 a pop, and they told little old ladies in the 70s that they were collectible, right? But the result is that all these little old ladies, they're passing away because they're 900 years old, and they have these pristine, perfectly preserved, figurines still in their original boxes, but they're not worth anything now because everybody preserved them. It's a fascinating dynamic, right? So just sort of fun to see the way that human beings and rarity sort of works like that.
Updates to the bolt include the Mark II call pattern bolt rifle. This version was produced during the latter period of the 41st millennium for the Primaris Space Marines and named after Major Belisarius Call. This bolter is said to have been recrafted and re-engineered to near perfection of standards.
Nothing is ever engineered to perfection, right? It's just you engineer out flaws, but technology always changes, right? You always find new ways to do things. Even the Imperium, right? Even Belarius Call, the one living being in the Imperium actually doing R&D, he'll improve on his design forever, you know?
There are a great many specific patterns of bolt gun, but a few of these include the Avenger Mega Bolter. Now, think of an A10's 30mm cannon, and you're on the right track, but scale it up. The Avenger Mega Bolter is a devastating rapid-fire weapon and is mounted on strike aircraft and Space Marine Fire Raptors. A smaller single version of the Vulcan Mega Bolter, this 5-barreled electronically fired rotary weapon can devastate ground and air targets with ease. The Heavy Bolter is a much heavier variation of a bolt gun. It's essentially a support weapon and it uses a much higher caliber of round. It features a high fire rate as well and minimal maintenance requirements. It can operate as a static weapon for Imperial Guard mounted on tanks and armor, but it's also carried by Space Marine Devastator units. Standard bolters still use a firing pin mechanism, but the Heavy Bolter uses an electronic pulse to maintain high rates of automatic fire. Space Marines and even sorority.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so actually this is just recently in the news. The U.S. Navy spent some insane volume of money, I'm going to say in the billions, on a railgun. And they really thought this railgun was going to be the future of naval warfare, right? It would allow them to carry more ammunition. It would be powered by the ship's reactor, and it would just be this like great leap forward in naval technology. But despite coming really close and having some like sort of working prototypes, they just could never get the thing to function in a combat configuration. And just recently, they ditched it. They scrapped it. They said they're going to walk away from trying to innovate electronically fired, magnetically propelled railguns. So it's just interesting that, you think like switching over to an electronic firing mechanism would be very easy, very straightforward, just a minor change. But, it really isn't. I know this. He's not saying it's a railgun. He's saying that it's electronically fired, meaning an electrical signal triggers the round to shoot out the barrel. I know.
Astartes can brace wield a heavy bolter and fire from the hip when using also an ammo feed backpack. The weapon is then aimed via a HUD and integrated laser pointer system. The Godwin pattern bolter remains the current most common pattern for Imperial Space Marines. It has a built-in ammo counter, a sickle-shaped magazine carrying 30 rounds and firing a standard 75 caliber bolt and depleted deuterium core. This bolter
What's depleted about the deuterium? Right, depleted uranium. Well, depleted uranium is uranium that's gone through its half-life? No, but then it'd be lead. Okay, I don't even know what depleted uranium is.
Typically fires in bursts of 4 rounds and has a genetic palm print reader as well. It also has an internal targeter linked to the Marine's helmet for improved accuracy. The Phobos pattern R017 was associated with Mark II Crusade armor. It's the most venerable design of bolter used by the Astartes, and this carried a...
Oh, interesting. He's a left-handed firer. Look at that. See, the one thing that's really aggravating about semi-automatic rifles is that they have to eject their cartridges to one side. And because most firers are right-handed, they eject the cartridge to the right. The problem is if you're a left-handed firer like yours truly, the cartridge doesn't eject to the right, it ejects into your face. And so this is the quintessential experience of me shooting an assault rifle or an assault pattern rifle. It's me getting hit in the face with brass, and it's really annoying.
70 caliber round, not the more standard 75 used in the modern bolters. Most of the Phobos pattern bolt guns were fabricated on Mars at the beginning of the Imperium. Relic bolt guns are extremely rare and are believed to have been used by the Emperor's warriors during the earliest days of the Imperium, and they bear an eagle's claw and thunderbolt symbols. These are considered holy relics imbued with the literal wrath of the Emperor. Stalker bolters are standard bolt guns but have a longer barrel and longer range optic. They are essentially more reminiscent of a battle rifle or a marksman weapon. There are then further iterations of the weapons that are more customized for the user or specific unit in its deployment. Storm bolters are double-barreled iterations of standard bolt.
It's sort of interesting, to talk a little bit more about what is a battle rifle. And I mean, a battle rifle is any full-length rifle used by a military as a standard issue rifle. But classically, when you say battle rifle, most people think of a bolt-action, full-sized round iron sight rifle used by mass troops in usually the First World War or Second World War era. And what's fascinating about them is that so again, I've got an old Mosin Nagant. In fact, I think I'm gonna show it to you guys. Let's pause this for a sec. Okay, guys. So I have here, right, let's see if we can get this and not hit the mic. There we go. So this is a standard Soviet-produced Mosin Nagant 9130. Now, if you look there, you can actually see. There it is, the year that it was produced, 35. And the other stamp, of course, tells you it was made in Ishevsk Arms Factory. Let's see if we can get it there. You can see the hammer and sickle. There it is. There's the hammer and sickle. See it? Okay, so look at the sight picture, right? So this thing shoots here. Well, we practice good firearm safety. As you can see, the rifle is clear. But what's fascinating is that it shoots a tremendously powerful round, right? On par with the 30-06. But you can see that it's got iron sights, right? There's the front sight post, or there's the rear sight post. There's the front sight post. But here's what's fascinating. Look at the elevation. Now, this part of the front sight post, right? You look through this little notch, and it lines up with the pin on the front sight, or the post. But if you can determine how far away your enemy is in meters, and you adjust this back, and you can see it raises the front sight post, therefore tilting the rifle so that it gets more of an arc, and you're going to hit a target further away. But look at how high this elevation goes, right? You see that? That is a 2-0, my friends. That means that they thought that their troops may have a situation in which they have to shoot 2,000 meters away, right? That's something like, that's miles, right? With iron sights, look at what you would have to do to the rifle to shoot 2,000 meters away. You would have to hold it at literally this angle, right? This is utter madness. Yeah, that is the angle. If you wanted to shoot, yeah, this is the angle you would have to line it up at. It's crazy what they expected old school soldiers to do with iron sights and these tremendously overpowered rounds. Okay, thank you for indulging me in this history lesson.
So in a turret gunning weapon, and Terminator Marines, because of their limited manual dexterity, usually will carry box magazines with anything like 150 rounds in them. When not being used by a Terminator, the magazine is probably going to be smaller, like a 60 round variation. Its ammunition though remains the same as standard bolt guns, and this weapon fires twin rounds, giving the user between 30 and 75 shots. The Tigris pattern bolter was discovered on Forge World Tigris before the Horus Heresy, and it carries a 60 caliber bolt. The STC design for this weapon has now since been lost, but some Tigris pattern bolt guns continue to exist in the Imperium, and as with any relics unable to be replicated, they are revered by their users. The Vulcan Mega Bolter.
They're so dumb. They're just so... Losing an STC? Like, damn, guys, copy paste.
is a devastating dual iteration of the Avenger Mega Bolter. It's twice as nasty for its enemies, and its immense rate of fire makes it a horrific anti-infantry or anti-vehicle weapon. If anything is left alive after the firing stops, the chances are that all that will remain are carbonized fragments of its target. These are usually mounted only upon Titans.
Okay.
In addition to its varying ammunition, bolters have a variety of different magazine types. The standard sickle magazine is what's seen on most bolt guns and is just stock, typically carrying between 20 and 30 rounds. Straight magazines do exist, but they're not so commonly used now and generally hold less ammo, something like 10 to 20 bolts. You might see these on the likes of Stalker bolters or heavy bolt pistols.
Okay, so what's interesting is the reason the banana magazine was designed is because rounds tend to have a very thick part of propellant and they narrow towards the tip. And so logically, if you want to stack more of them together, they're going to start to form this sickle pattern. And so you can fit more of those rounds in each magazine when you give it that banana-shaped look. But if bolter rounds are shaped like shotgun rounds, which they kind of appear to be, then you may not have a mechanical benefit to having a sickle-shaped magazine, right? If you wanted to stack shotgun rounds because they're equally thick all the way through, you would just want to have like the A12 box or drum slug magazine.
Drum magazines are less common again and are known to be fairly unreliable. They compensate with a capacity of 40, 60 or 100 bolt rounds, and they're known to jam, which consequently is problematic given the danger of many enemies facing the Imperium. A jam often is going to mean death, but the trade-off is considered acceptable. These are frequently seen on storm bolters used by Terminators. Belt feeds tend to suggest use on a static weapon like a machine gun, but actually they're used on older bolt guns as well, used by the traitorous Chaos Space Marines. Because of the problems in the nature of using these belt feeds, these fell out of fashion long ago in the standard Imperial Space Marines and are no longer used. The G+X is a magazine popular with planetary law enforcement or hive gangs. It basically takes two magazines which are attached by tape or cloth and essentially into an improvised means of fast reloading. This is not produced by the Imperium for standard issue. It's
just like if you ever seen it, you can also see sometimes irregular troops, or like we would see the Afghan security forces do that with AK rounds where they tape them upside down, so you just, when you're done, you pop it out, turn it around, pop the other one back in, you've already got a fresh mag. But the danger is, of course, that when you've got an exposed magazine bottom and you have to say hit the dirt or you drop your weapon, right, that's a chance for not only dirt to get into the magazine and onto the rounds that'll jam your rifle, but it's a chance for those components that need to fit firmly into the magazine well, it's a chance for them to get bent and twisted and warped, and then when you really need them, they're not there, they won't fit in the weapon.
It's worth pointing out that some bolters are designed to be used by unaugmented humans, like the lock patterns, which are specifically designed for use like arbites, people who require more stopping power of a weapon because they work in dangerous environments like a hive city, and this is where that kind of ammunition magazine might occur. Many situations have arisen over the centuries that have required specialized ammunition for Imperial bolt weapons. Now, standard bolts, as previously described, are 75 caliber and utilize a depleted deuterium core and a diamantine tip. But there are many other rounds. Anti-phasic shells are used by Deathwatch kill teams, specifically in relation to Necrons. They were developed to try and prevent Necrons from phasing out and then returning to their tombs, the goal being to ensure that when they kill a Necron, they stay dead. Bane strike rounds are shells developed secretly by the Alpha Legion during the Great Crusade, and these rounds used by the traitors to the Imperium were designed to specifically breach Space Marine power armor and were first used at the Drop Site Massacre, where devastating losses would be inflicted to the Iron Hands, Raven Guard and Salamanders. Bloodshard shells are utilized by the Blood Angels in their Angelus bolt guns, and these contain a payload of razor filament, are very effective against armor. Dragonfire.
Wait, razor? Okay, so we also, in the modern world, also have different shells, usually for tanks, for armored vehicles. And they do have different effects. We also do have, like, tracer rounds There's like green tip armor piercing. For pistols, there's stuff like hollow point or hydroshock shells that are meant to be, more effective against flesh versus rounds that you want to have penetrate, say a Kevlar, a soft Kevlar vest. So there are some variants like this, but tanks are the ones that have the greatest variety, and they will sometimes even have shells like flechettes, so where you get dozens or hundreds of darts shooting out like a shotgun. That was used like in Vietnam to thwart like charges and enemy advances. But yeah, you sometimes see that variety of rounds, but the truth is that the difference in capabilities of those rounds is not super tremendous. You can watch, YouTube has a ton of videos of people trying different rounds and stacking them up against different armor types, and the fact is even armor piercing rounds are more effective, but not tremendously so, against modern ceramic or reinforced steel plate armor.
Fire bolts are used by Stern Guard veteran Marines, and they release a superheated gas that makes enemies using cover essentially worthless. They're designed to inflict maximum damage for each round against targets even in heavy cover. Hellfire rounds were designed to specifically combat Tyranids and fill the core and tip of each round with a mutagenic acid, as well as thousands of needles, which upon firing into a target's flesh will pump the acid into that target. They do have equally an unpleasant effect on all organic targets. Inferno Bolts are also pretty unpleasant. They're designed to inflict immolation on their targets and carbonize them with superheated chemical fire. The standard deuterium core of a bolt round is replaced with an oxyphosphorus gel known as promethium. This is also used in Imperial flamer weapons, and the gel ignites on contact with oxygen. It's similar to napalm in that it sticks to an individual, continuing to burn on its own and often immolate them from the inside out. Kraken Penetrator rounds are heavy-duty armor-piercing rounds, where the deuterium this time is being replaced with a solid adamantine core and a heavy primary charge. Upon impact, the casing will peel and the adamantine needle accelerates into its target, where the larger detonator propels this metal to be especially effective against heavily armoured infantry. Metal Storm
that's exactly how a heat round works.
frag shells are a cluster ammunition, and they detonate prior to impact on the enemy, spray a storm of shrapnel over the target, usually with horrifically shredding consequences if they're not heavily armoured. This might be used well against, say, orcs.
And that sounds like buckshot, right? That's if you're talking about a weapon that has actually a lot of variations of ammunition, and those variations perform way differently. Shotguns are a classic example of that, right? Different shells are loaded out for different games. So birdshot will be tiny BBs, but in huge quantities, whereas buckshot will be only 8 to 10 pellets, but fairly large diameter ones. And of course, the largest is a slug, a single 1 ounce hunk of lead traveling towards your target.
Psycannon bolt rounds are used by the Ordo Malleus and the Grey Knights and have significant damage properties versus psychic and demonic targets, where normal rounds would do very little damage to these ethereal creatures. Scorpius Bolts were handcrafted by Tech Marines during the Great Crusade and subsequent heresy. They contain a 2-stage warhead with a micro-guidance and needle-like sabot dart, which vaporized when striking an armoured target, thus giving it improved armour penetration. These rounds would have to, though, be hand-loaded before firing, and so are generally pretty impractical. Stalker silence shells are somewhat similar to subsonic rounds and are meant for covert fighting. This is usually combined with a gas cartridge replacing the propellant base for silent firing. Tempest bolts utilize plasma shock generators that emit electromagnetic and thermal radiation when the shell detonates. These Tempest shells are best used against, say, mechanical targets.
So again, the US doesn't have standard there's some anti-equipment, again, not rounds, but they have like grenades, like M203 grenades, that some of them do have anti-equipment specializations. But what we do have is bombs dropped from aircraft also have a tremendous variety. And there are specialized rounds meant to short circuit electronics or power grids or anything like that that will enable the shutdown of communication systems, the shutdown of command and control, and so there's a little variety of there. That's, again, it's not a true EMP. I don't even know if EMPs are legal under the law of war.
Vengeance rounds are created using an unstable flux core tech, which makes them extremely hazardous to use, but also extremely effective in penetrating armoured targets. And they were designed specifically to wreak vengeance against traitors to the Imperium, notably the Chaos Space Marines. They're comparable to the Bane strike rounds of the Alpha Legion. But then you also have something called stable flux core bolts, which are similar to these vengeance rounds. They were discovered in 992 of Millennium 41, and the STC for these design bolt rounds are capable of melting ceramite, as I say, similar to vengeance rounds, but without the unstable, dangerous nature of them. The bolt gun has been the standardized armament for the Astartes for as long as the Imperium has existed, but back in the earliest days of the Imperium, they also used another type of weapon known as a Volkite caliver, and these were ancient weapons from the Dark Age of technology, and proved so complex that they were unable to be mass-produced. They were a thermal ray weapon and presented considerable firepower for their size, as well as being easier to handle than modern bolt weapons. Volkite weapons could penetrate thick ceramite with one concentrated beam shot, and it had an obviously devastating effect on organic matter as well. Throughout the Great Crusade and into the period of heresy, these weapons fell out of favour for the more standardised bolt weapons, but some remain in service even though they are exceedingly rare, almost legendary in status. One of the most notable users of Volkite weapons was the Primarch of the traitorous Legion, the Emperor's Children, who used a master-crafted Volkite charger, which was named Firebrand. The bolt gun, despite its...
So, there is, in the real world, we generally can reverse engineer any technology that you can get your hands on. The Soviets famously reverse engineered the B-25, B-52, when one B-52, US B-52, was forced to land. I think it was a B-52. Again, commenters, let me know what I'm thinking of here. But I think it was it was either a B-24 Liberator or a B-52. But the B-52 had to force land in a Soviet-controlled country. The Soviets took possession of the bomber and promptly reverse-engineered every single part on the entire plane, documented it all, and then returned the plane a few months later to the United States, as though they were being, generous. And of course, a couple months later, they had manufactured their own B-52 clone. What's interesting is that while you don't have that problem, you do have the issue sometimes where a weapon is so expensive and so tough to manufacture that risking it in combat no longer becomes worth it. And the example that a lot of commentators or thinkers worry about in this day and age is the United States and its supercarriers. Obviously, they use the carrier groups to protect shipping lanes and to advance U.S. interests all over the world. But the problem is when you only have 12 of them, and the modern ones are, I think, tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars to purchase and construct, that if the enemy was to develop a weapon, and supposedly China is developing carrier killer missiles, if you can develop a weapon that could sink a carrier, then that carrier could never enter that theater of operations. It's just too risky to lose $100 billion in carrier, thousands of personnel, dozens of fighter aircraft or various aircraft. It's just not worth it. And so just the existence of a cheap, a $10 million missile that can sink a $100 billion carrier or $10 billion carrier is an excellent trade-off for a lot of countries. And so, again, you end up with this sort of, your advanced weapon system becomes too rare to use. And that may be what he's describing here with these Volkite weapons falling out of favor.
Standardized nature is a treasured weapon, a divine tool of the Emperor of Man and bringer of death to the enemies of the Imperium. As the primary weapon of the Astartes, its construction demands exacting standards and is only produced by the finest materials of skilled artisans. Even the ammunition for bolters can't be easily manufactured outside of specifically specialized fabricators. To a Space Marine, the bolt gun is an extension of their self and duty. They regularly will perform rituals as part of this maintenance to keep its machine spirit in symbiosis with its user. Very much in a sense, the Astartes are one and the same with their bolt weapons. To see them without this defining tool seems a travesty in itself, and they go beyond being a simple projectile weapon. They are the tools of the Emperor's wrath, meting out fiery justice to the enemies of mankind and the Imperium. For many warriors of the Imperium, the spirit and meaning behind the weapons surpass their combat effectiveness. And this is the most important context to take away from the weapon itself. A lasgun used by a guardsman can be stripped, cleaned, and a quick prayer mumbled to it, but a bolt weapon is an extension of the Emperor's will. It is not simply a gun. It is the strength of the Imperium, the messenger of death, and the spirit of the Imperial cult. Venerated and feared by the enemies of mankind, the bolt gun is a symbol of strength, power, and the Imperium of mankind itself.
Interesting. Okay, I appreciate his soaring orchestral music to end it off. Yeah, again, we have to think, in our modern era, we view these technological weapons as tools, and they must, because in the competitive world of military operations, you have to discard the tool the day it becomes obsolete, and you just can't miss it. But of course, that's not usually how things go. You know, as we've talked about in other videos, World War I, famous for fighting with pre-modern tactics against modern weapons like machine guns, tends to go very, very poorly. But when you're somewhere like the Imperium, the worry about other races advancing their technology on you is not all that great. All right, guys, that is all I had for you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure, please, to check out the merch store. I have all sorts of shirts. You can see here. There's another one. I've got the shirts back there. And also check out the second channel, uploading more and more videos to that. Follow me on Instagram. And yeah, that's all I had. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.